As we were saying, biblical authors like repetition, and there's a particular technique of repetition that is called resumptive repetition, or my teacher Hanan Brichto liked to call it synoptic resumptive-expansive storytelling. Synoptic resumptive-expansive storytelling is where an author tells a story once, often in a summary way, and then goes back and tells the story again, expanding on details or telling it from a different point of view. Let me give you some examples. I think the Bible begins with synoptic resumptive-expansive storytelling. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I submit to you that that is not the first thing that God does in creation. That's the whole thing. And that the rest of Genesis 1 is resumptive and expansive, to say, in somewhat more detail, exactly how God created the heavens and the earth. Note chapter 2 and verse 4 that summarizes what's gone on at the end of the narrative using language of heaven and earth similar to verse 1 of chapter 1. When you get a little farther into Genesis 1, you get the account of how God created man, male and female, in his own image in Genesis 1:26 and 27. Well, that would be a synoptic version of the story, but then you would have the resumptive and expansive version of it in chapter 2, where it explains how God created man from the dust of the earth and Eve from Adam's rib. Again, that would be synoptic, resumptive, expansive storytelling. And we could make the case that Genesis 15 does the same sort of thing, and we'll actually deal with that under the documentary hypothesis. And there's many other passages. I argue it in my dissertation for Exodus 19 through 24, that chapter 19 gives a synoptic version of the giving of the law, and chapters 20 through 23 is resumptive and expansive. You get the same thing with the ark crossing the Jordan in Joshua chapters 3 through 5. Just reading it straight through, it seems like the ark crosses Jordan several times, but it's retelling the story. Flashback is another way of describing this, that it flashes back to the beginning of the story and then retells it again from another angle or to give more detail. Golden calf story also contains it. Even the book of Jonah seems to contain it. And so that's synoptic, resumptive, expansive storytelling. Another narrative technique of analyzing a narrative is to do gap filling. Gap filling is use of deliberate ambiguity or gaps in telling the story. And the reader, in order to make sense out of a story, has to fill the gaps to make sense out of it. And indeed, it's in filling such gaps that we come to a deeper understanding of a text's meaning. So, for example, and we mentioned this before, why did Uriah the Hittite not go home to sleep with his wife, as David basically tells him to in 2 Samuel chapter 11? Well, it says that what he did instead was to sleep with the servants of David at the palace. And he tells David the next day that the reason that he doesn't do so is doesn't go home was because the ark is in battle, and he's such a good soldier that he couldn't consider enjoying the benefits of hearth and home in that circumstance. Though he was saying that to a person who was, at the time that kings go out to battle, had stayed home and was enjoying the benefits of hearth and home, and indeed sleeping not only with his own wife but Uriah's. One could fill the gap of why he doesn't go home by noting that, well, it was the servants of David that had brought Bathsheba to the palace, and perhaps on his way out, one of them kind of pulls him aside and tells him what had gone on. And so the real reason he doesn't go home is because he's heard rumor of of the adultery that his wife has committed with David, and from that he figures out why Uriah, who's normally a soldier, not a messenger boy, was called out of the battle to come home. Well, anyway, all this is, reading between the lines, trying to figure out why the character does what he does when the text doesn't explicitly tell us. And one way to fill the gap is to say, well, maybe Uriah heard a rumor, and that's why he didn't go home. Another case of gap filling. Why is it okay to kill a housebreaker at night, but not during the day in Exodus 22, verses 2 and 3? So if he's breaking in, it's the middle of the night, and then you kill him, well, you don't have blood guilt then. But if he comes in and it's the daylight, then you're not to kill him. And a plausible gap filling is to say, well, you don't know the intentions at night. Is he coming to rob, or is he coming to kill? And so it would be a matter of self-defense to kill a person at night. But if it's during the daytime, well, you can see, does he have a weapon? His intentions are probably clear that he's just a thief. He's not really a murderer. And therefore to kill him under those circumstances, when in fact you might be able to identify him too, would be considered murder, and therefore would bring blood guilt on a person. Or why does Joseph deceive his brothers and accuse them of being spies in Genesis 42? Does he really believe that they're spies? Clearly not. Well, then why does he do that? Well, even asking the question leads to gap filling. Let me move on to some other literary approaches, which I call reader-oriented approaches. Among these will be reader response criticism, deconstruction, liberation theology, and feminist literary criticism. First of all, reader-oriented approaches. Back in the days of historical criticism, the emphasis would be on the author. We want to know who the author is. We want to know his historical backdrop. We want to know as much as we can his biography. And, of course, one of the weaknesses of this approach is it doesn't really tell us much about what the text might mean today. It was all a question about the past. And often these questions about the author was unresolvable. And in pursuing these historical questions, well, sometimes the text was left behind. We're so interested in the historical backdrop and the authorship issues that we forget to read the text. Well, new criticism of the 1970s brought us back to the text, saying, well, it's not what the author meant, but it's what the text means. That's what's important. So we may not know much about the author, but we know what the text says, and we can figure out from what it says what it may mean. And so they examine the themes and the images and the character and the plot and the style and the metaphor and the point of view of narrators, and figure out who the readers implied and real are. And we do all that even where historical issues prove to be elusive. But then in the 1980s and beyond, there was an evolution that went all the way from what the author meant to a close reading of what the text meant to an emphasis on the reader. What does the text mean to me? In this reader response criticism, people like Stanley Fish would say things that the text does not exist apart from the reader's interpretive act. And he would emphasize the interpretive communities for whom the same text might have different meanings. So a hermeneutic issue is, can we objectively interpret what a text means? If meaning depends on who we are and what philosophical commitments we already have, then is it possible that we can never objectively analyze a text? And if we cannot objectively analyze a text, why even try? And so reader-oriented approaches tend to wear their ideological commitments on their sleeves. In the next video, we will examine some of these reader-oriented approaches, starting with deconstructionism.